Good day, my name is Keith Feely. This is my email address, and this is the address that I use on Twitter, which I use all the time, by the way, and from which you can get many of my resources. I want to speak to you today and introduce to you about something which I think will perhaps completely change your life and hopefully your children's lives. It addresses a question which I've heard numerous times over the last decades, and that's obviously concerning many parents and, to be perfectly honest, people who work with children. I was fortunate enough to be born in 1952 in the East End of London. Probably spotted that from my accent. But we moved out of London because it was in such a bad state of repair during the 50s. And in 1963, a miracle, an incredible thing happened. Yes, you're right, the Beatles became world famous. But more importantly, well, at least to me at the time, was I passed this bizarre exam called the 11 Plus. If you're outside of England or the UK, you probably had never even heard of the 11 Plus. To be perfect, I didn't understand it either at the time. But what it meant was that I was told to go to a different school to everybody that I lived with, just outside of London. And from that moment onwards, my life changed quite radically. And strangely enough, although my parents didn't really understand it at all, it put me in a situation where I was able to compare the difference between myself and my brothers and sisters and everybody I'd grown up with. So much so that by 1970 I actually went to university. Now this was almost another miracle, because nobody that we knew had ever gone to university. We had no idea how you got to university, and some way or other it happened to me. And unfortunately I was not really all that interested in being particularly good in academia, but at one stage, because I was doing chemistry, physics and maths, it became clear that I had to decide what I was going to do as a career. And in 1973 I decided that I wasn't going to become a professional footballer. I thought I was good enough, but others felt differently. Consequently, I went to Carnegie in Leeds, a PE college, to train to become a PE teacher. This was quite a bizarre thing, since I never got on with teachers when I was at secondary school, apart from the PE teachers. But once I started teaching in Leeds and in Keighley, I decided this was going to be my career, because I absolutely loved it. In those days they were desperately short of teachers, no change there, and they begged me to go back to my secondary school to become a PE teacher, but because my degree was in chemistry, actually it was more to be a science teacher. And as soon as I started teaching in that school that I once attended as a pupil, I started asking this question. The reason being is that I knew that I was a freak. I've never been anything else, to be perfectly honest, and I wanted to try to discover how it was that I became so unusual as compared to all the people around me. It meant that when I was teaching, what I decided to do was to begin researching. I was a scientist, I still am, and therefore research study is one of those things that I do automatically on a daily basis. And it became clear that this question was at the heart of what really I needed to try to discover. Now, at the time, I really knew very little about learning, and I knew little about teaching, to be perfectly honest. So consequently, this was going to be quite a difficult task. But I was fortunate enough that I had a lot of support from my head of science and my head of PE, and they pushed me and encouraged me to do these sorts of things. So by the early 80s, I was fortunate enough to start doing a diploma in education, and the answers to this question started to appear in front of me because I was able to get the research done. I'm standing here at the age of 67, now able to communicate for the last 20 plus years the answer to this particular question. And the answer to this particular question is on my left hand side here. These are the 8 skill areas, which I call them skill areas because my background's in PE. You can call them qualities, characteristics, you're all sorts of different abilities, but they are the 8 areas which basically any parent and anybody that's trying to help children should focus upon. And in fact, in recent times, the early years in various countries have realised that these 8 areas are the ones that really matter. Remember that I'm a scientist, so therefore I'm only prepared to use the evidence which I have. And we have lots of evidence now to support this. This brief outline starts off with that one on the left hand side there. Learn effectively. This is something that we are able to do as a species because evolution has allowed us to develop the ability to start to learn really from the moment we come out of the womb. In fact, we now know that we learn quite a lot, a long time before we come out the womb. Unfortunately, unless this is developed and nurtured from a very early age, we don't necessarily become able to continue to learn and cope with the incredible amount of changes that we have in life. And this is now in the 21st century a major issue, because unless we are able to continually learn and cope with the continual changes, we quite clearly struggle. And you will find that at the heart of many of the problems that you will encounter with what I call vulnerable young people, and some of them not so young. The second one there is the area of communication, which again, because of our evolution, has allowed us to communicate in a huge variety of ways. In the early years, we were only able to pick up information from various sounds, from facial expressions, from things like using my hands, body language, etc., intonation of voice. But after a relatively short period of time, most of us, if we're fortunate enough, learn how to speak and learn how to listen quite well, some not so well, and concentrate on what people are actually saying, because this is an integral part of communication. In later years, we learn how to read and write, again if we're very fortunate, and in recent times been able to learn how to communicate electronically via all sorts of medium and social media. The one over on the far corner there is basically what I've called cognition, because it's one of the areas which historically we used to think of as intelligence. Now, it's really more about solving problems and being able to make good decisions. That's why various IQ tests, and indeed much of the 11 plus in the olden days, was very much focused upon the ability to do that. For myself, as a maths, science person, analysing difficult, complex problems has been a key part of my life. And unfortunately today, most of the problems that our young people encounter are remarkably complex. In days gone by, when we lived simple lives in villages and in small conurbations, they were much simpler and straightforward. Now, incredibly complicated, incredibly difficult, because we live in a global community. The metacognition underneath it is actually a word which is, for me, scientific, but describing self-awareness, knowing ourselves. In the classics and in the Greek times, they used to talk in terms about knowing thyself. And this is really about understanding who we are as a person, our strengths and weaknesses, so that we actually are able to assess ourselves accurately. In recent times, self-esteem has become a major issue with a large number of young people and less young, and actually this is at the heart of it, because we are now influenced by everything around us throughout the globe, and it causes our awareness to be much more distorted than it was when we were in much simpler areas. Underneath it is an area which, if you've brought up young children, you realise we're not born able to control or manage our emotions, but we can, with help and support, learn how to self-discipline, to self-regulate, and actually not be able to, if you like, cause problems for ourselves and for others in certain situations. That's why behaviour is actually a terminology which has been used a great deal, but actually it's merely an outcome of our inability to be able to conform in a certain environment. This one here, the word resilient, is a science word which we use a lot in physics, but it's now used a great deal to describe people, because we're talking about the ability to cope with forces, pressures, stresses, and then bounce back from it. That's why in recent times there's a term which people may have come across called mindset. Growth mindset is the ability to bounce back and actually use setbacks, pressures and problems that we've had to improve ourselves in the future. These last two, Howard Gardner in 1983 called intersocial skills, and they are part of the 7 skills as they were in those times, in 7 intelligences that he described we needed to have. That's how far back much of this goes. But these two relate to how well we cope with other people. This one here, empathy, has now become a huge problem because we are involved, whether we like it or not, by a huge diversity of backgrounds and cultures from all over the globe. If we were in a village or in a very small conurbation years ago, everybody would be brought up in a similar environment and there wouldn't be much diversity. That's certainly not true now. So the ability to empathise, to understand why others think and feel and behave in completely different ways to the way in which we've been brought up is very, very difficult. And today we have lots of issues caused because people don't empathise very well with others. Which leads us on to the last one here. This is to do with the interpersonal skill of being able to relate to others and work in teams. Because of my sporting background, I've been playing in teams since I was about 8 or 9, and therefore learning how to live and cope with other people has been an integral part of my life. But for many, this is not an easy thing to do. So the skills to be able to relate and cooperate are things which now have become much more difficult for many because of the huge diversity and the need to be able to manage that. And therefore, the leaders that we so desperately need in the modern world are people who are able to amalgamate and integrate these 8 skill areas to actually help us develop and cope as a species. That's a very brief outline, a very brief introduction to a number that I hope will be of some use to you, which I've called KEEFTALKs, using the idea of TED Talks as an inspiration. And I hope you found that one worthwhile, and in future we'll look in on many of the others which I've produced. Thank you very much. Hope you see me again soon. Bye.